Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 238. This time I'm going to talk about this record by Paul Chambers, the masterful hard bop and post bop bassist who played so many years with the Miles Davis Quintet. Bass on top. This, as you can see by the blinding sheen on the laminated record cover, is the recent Tone Poet reissue by Blue Note. This, of course, came out in 1957, and this is the remastered version, remastered by Kevin Gray in 2020. My copy, like a lot of the records in this series, is magnificent, with the asterisk that there was an issue on the original master tape, or at least in the original recording, where some of the mics were overloaded. This shows up on side 2, a little bit distracting. At this point, he's still only 22 years of age, and given his relative youth, there's remarkable license given him by the label. It is distinct from the music he was making with Miles, but it's not unrelated, and you can feel Davis's influence, particularly in terms of the song selection. When he makes this record, Paul Chambers is just a year removed from having won Downbeat magazine's New Star Award in 1956. Chambers is credited with having reintroduced in the post-war era the bowed or arco style of bass playing in jazz. This, of course, was something which his idol, Jimmy Blanton, who'd played bass with Duke Ellington, had done a ton of pre-war. He was born in 1935 in Pittsburgh, but his formative years musically take place in Detroit, where he moves to be with his father after his mom dies in 1948. He starts off as a horn player, tuba, baritone, a variety of other pieces, but he switches to bass in his early teens. He listens as much as he can to the great bass players of the era, Blanton, Pettiford, Mingus, Heath, DeVivier, and he's also a huge fan of beboppers like Charlie Parker and Bud Powell. This is all still when he's around age 15. At his high school, which had a strong music program, he was playing bass in the symphony orchestra, still spreading himself around in different kinds of contexts in jazz, playing baritone sax in at least one of his teenage bands, but increasingly playing bass was the thing. And this was a problem because his dad did not want him to pursue a musical career. And in fact, at one point, he takes his school training bass and he throws it down the stairs of the house. So in his later teens, Chambers actually has to practice his bass at the houses of other young musicians in Detroit, people like Barry Harris, because his dad won't have it in the house. Fortunately for young Paul, the jazz scene in Detroit in the early 1950s was incredible, and he ends up playing in the clubs with people like Thad Jones, Kenny Burrell, and he gets a break in 1955, age 20, when Paul Quinichette, the saxophonist, asked him to come and tour with him. Pretty soon after that tour with Quinichette, he moves to New York in the middle of 1955, and pretty soon he's in a group led by J.J. Johnson and Kai Winding, both of whom were jazz trombonists. He also soon gets a gig in Greenwich Village playing with the George Wellington Quintet along with Jackie McLean, Donald Byrd, and Art Taylor. Those guys all loved his work, and they passed on news about the new guy to Miles Davis, who had just signed for Columbia that summer and was looking for a new quintet. Chambers ends up joining Miles along with Red Garland and Philly Joe Jones and Sonny Rollins. Now Rollins, of course, leaves, Coltrane comes in, and so literally within a few months of arriving in New York, Chambers is now in what would become known as Miles Davis's first great quintet. Chambers ends up staying with Miles from 1955 until 1963. Obviously, in that period, he plays on all kinds of great records. And right away in 1955, they go into the studio. They make Around Midnight, and they also make a collection of ballads called Miles, the New Miles Davis Quintet. This is the period, of course, when Miles still has a recording contract with Prestige, but is also signed for Columbia. So Around Midnight is a Columbia record, but it has to be held back till he's done with Prestige. It doesn't come out for, I think, a year or two of 57 or 58. Going into 1956, Miles still owes Prestige 4 records, and so Chambers is part of the quintet that makes, in a total of 2 days recording time, 4 different records, working, relaxing, cooking, and steaming. Meanwhile, his own reputation as an artist in his own right is growing by leaps and bounds, and in 1956, Chambers makes his debut as a leader, Chambers Music, a delegation from the East, with a quartet including John Coltrane. That spring of '56, he joins Philly Joe, Garland, and Coltrane, playing on Sonny Rollins' classic record, Tenor Madness. He also finds time to make his own second record as a leader, Whims of Chambers, that summer, and then in the fall he also plays on Thelonious Monk's classic, Brilliant Corners. The axis of all this, and combined with his talent, the reason why all these different doors were opening was, of course, his presence in the Davis Quintet. Over this period, Miles is coming to hold Chambers in higher and higher esteem. The consequence of this is that Chambers is getting to go along for the ride in some of Miles's different tangents that he's exploring musically in the late 50s. Not just the modal jazz stuff in Kind of Blue, but also Miles's side hustle that he had going with the Canadian arranger Gil Evans, with larger numbers of players, more complex arrangements, more classical influences, and so on. And so Chambers is also present when Miles and Gil Evans make Miles Ahead in May 1957. That month, he also made his second record as a leader for Blue Note with Donald Byrd, Tommy Flanagan, Clifford Jordan, and Elvin Jones, although that record wouldn't actually be released until 1958. In the summer of 1957, he toured with Davis, but he made some time to get into the studio and make this album. This record was made July 14th, 1957, in Rudy Van Gelder's old studio at his parents' house in Hackensack, New Jersey. Alfred Lyon of Blue Note is, of course, the producer. Paul Chambers is on bass, and you'll note, if you look inside the gatefold, that he's playing an old bass here, which apparently is a German bass from 1900 or thereabouts, with a carved female face at the top, which apparently was a feature added by Chambers later on. And the bass itself, allegedly, is of somewhat dubious provenance because, so the story on the internet goes, this bass was actually liberated from the car of a symphony player by Chambers and his bass playing friend from Detroit, Doug Watkins. If this is true, and there's all kinds of reasons to be skeptical, it probably happened in Detroit before Chambers came to New York, because pretty soon after he got to New York, as I mentioned, he was basically in the big time and he didn't have to go about lifting basses. Getting back to the rest of the players, although this record is largely a star vehicle for Chambers, there is some serious talent on board with him as well, including Kenny Burrell, the magnificent jazz guitarist who, frankly, has never been on a bad record that I can tell. On drums is Art Taylor, who was somebody Chambers knew through Miles Davis's circles, and on piano is Hank Jones. This guy, this is Elvin and Thad's brother, was on zillions of jazz records. He may have some kind of record for being a sideman on more records than anybody else, although strangely enough, despite all the great records he was on, he's only actually on 2 of the great Blue Notes from the classic era of Blue Note, and this is one of them. The other one is Cannonball Adderley's Something Else. Side 1 starts with Yesterdays, which, thanks to the original recording and the subsequent remastering, is an incredible sounding track. In fact, this whole Side 1 really is breathtaking. Begins with a bit of a back and forth between Burrell and Chambers. Chambers is playing the bowed bass here. The other players come in, but it's fairly subtle, the accompaniment, and then the track switches from what I think is a minor key to a major key. It really starts to swing at that point. Fantastic track. The second track is You'd Be So Nice to Come Home To, and again, the titular bass is on top, supported by this fantastic brushwork by Taylor and Burrell's gentle chords. When Burrell eventually does solo, it's this lovely round tone. Rarely does a guitarist get as good a tone as he gets here. The final track of Side 1, Chasing the Bird, the Charlie Parker standard, begins with Burrell stating the theme, Chambers improvising, and then Burrell's solo, which is the real highlight of the track. Although I gotta say, when Taylor does a drum solo towards the end here, the three-dimensionality of that is frankly jaw-dropping, such is the quality of this particular pressing. Anyway, it's a real treat for the ears, both in terms of the quality of the music, but just the sound of this record, that first side. Dear Old Stockholm starts Side 2, and this is a regular piece which the Miles Davis group would perform. This piece also features Burrell for the most part because his soloing is interspersed with other interventions by the band, but he's really the star. The tone, again, that he gets here is incredible. Unfortunately, this is the track where the mic overload is the most obvious. It will bother you as much as you let it. If you just want to tell yourself it's brushwork and just kind of move past it, then that's probably an effective strategy, but it's there. The next track on Side 2 is the theme. Distortion issues aren't nearly as bad as they are in the first track. There's still a little bit there. Actually, it's the bass as much as anything which is overloaded. Here Chambers is using a bow, and it's a very three-dimensional, warm, detailed sound, slight overload notwithstanding. The final track, Confessin', is basically a vehicle for Chambers, starting off with some really rapid, frankly phenomenal pizzicato. Everyone else comps along quietly. The only exception is a dainty little solo from Jones at the end. This, as other people have said, is a remarkably varied and mature piece of music from a guy who is still basically a kid, frankly, 22, despite the fact that he's holding down the bass chair in probably the best jazz band in the world at the time. If you like Paul Chambers' music, or you're just a fan of the double bass, there are a few records that I can think of which feature both Chambers and or the bass so centrally and so forward in the mix as this one. You have to mark it down a little bit for the technical flaws which detract a bit from the experience on Side 2, but it's still, frankly, an irreplaceable record in Paul Chambers' catalog, and it is a must listen as far as I'm concerned. I give it 4.5 out of 5 stars.